right there. We got a flag on your status. Hands visible. I am an airline captain, sir. Here are my federal credentials. Uniform doesn't imply citizenship. We have a report you're illegal. That is incorrect. I am a U.S. citizen. You can verify this right now. Stop talking. Turn around. You are being detained. I am complying, but you are making a mistake on camera.
The security camera was already rolling inside the terminal. Fluorescent lights reflected off polished floors. Travelers moved through checkpoints in practiced silence. In that controlled environment, federal agents approached a man standing near the gate area and initiated a detention that would later cost the city $9.2 million. At the moment the agents made contact, nothing about the scene suggested escalation. According to the footage, the man complied with basic commands. He did not attempt to leave, he did not raise his voice, he did not interfere with airport operations. What the agents did not know, what the camera silently captured, was the professional record standing in front of them. The man was an airline captain, not in title alone, but in function. For years, his work had required him to operate under federal aviation regulations, to pass recurrent background checks, medical certifications, and security clearances. His daily responsibilities included command authority over commercial aircraft, compliance with FAA directives, coordination with air traffic control, and responsibility for the safety of hundreds of passengers at a time. Every action in his professional life was documented, audited, and regulated by federal standards. That history mattered, not as status, not as privilege, but as evidence of lawful presence, routine federal vetting, and verified identity within one of the most regulated professions in the country. Yet inside the terminal, the interaction moved in the opposite direction. According to the footage, the agents demanded proof of citizenship. The request was repeated. The tone shifted. The posture changed. The decision to detain was no longer temporary. It became procedural. This was the first decision point. In an airport environment saturated with cameras, where every movement is logged and every command is recorded, that decision narrowed the agent's ability to disengage. Each additional step would require justification. Each additional minute would harden the legal record. The captain did not invoke his profession to assert dominance. He did not threaten. He did not obstruct. According to the video, he remained controlled, responding within the bounds of the encounter while the agents continued to press forward. What the camera shows is not chaos. It shows structure, a structured environment, a structured profession, and a structured authority choosing to proceed without confirming the foundation of its actions. The irony is unavoidable. A man whose career depended on federal compliance was being treated as though compliance itself was in question. By the time supervisors became aware of the detention, the legal posture of the encounter had already shifted. What began as a brief stop inside a secure facility was now a documented deprivation of liberty. And the clock was running. The consequences of that moment would not be immediate. They would unfold later, through reviews, filings, and negotiations, ending with a jury award that could be measured in millions. This was another chance to stop. They didn't. Inside a commercial airport terminal, legitimacy is not abstract. It is procedural. Every individual who enters restricted space does so through layers of verification designed to establish identity, intent, and lawful presence. According to the footage, the airline captain was operating entirely within that system when federal agents initiated the detention. He was not attempting to bypass security. He was not entering a restricted area without authorization. He was not interfering with airport personnel. His presence in the terminal aligned with ordinary, lawful activity associated with air travel and aviation operations. Nothing visible on camera suggested urgency, threat, or disruption. That context matters because airports are not neutral spaces. They are among the most heavily regulated civilian environments in the United States. Identity checks, credentialing systems, and access controls are embedded into their daily function. Within that framework, the captain's legitimacy did not depend on explanation. It was presumed by design. Yet the agent's perception moved in a different direction. According to the footage, the interaction shifted from routine questioning to a demand for proof of citizenship. The demand itself altered the legal footing of the encounter. Citizenship inquiries by federal agents are not per se unlawful, but they are constrained. They require a lawful basis tied to specific statutory authority or reasonable suspicion grounded in observable facts. The camera records no such facts being articulated. This is where the legitimacy gap opens. From the agent's perspective, the man became a subject of inquiry. From the legal record preserved on video, he remained a U.S. citizen engaged in lawful conduct inside a public transportation facility. Those two realities existed simultaneously, and the distance between them widened with each repeated demand. The captain did not attempt to resolve the gap by appealing to status. According to the footage, he did not announce his profession to command deference. He did not invoke federal regulations or threaten complaints. He remained measured, responding within the scope of the encounter as the agents pressed forward. That restraint matters. Courts later reviewing such footage do not assess whether an individual could have clarified the situation more quickly. They assess whether the government's actions were justified at the moment they were taken. Silence, compliance, and non-resistance do not convert a lawful presence into reasonable suspicion. At this stage, the Fourth Amendment frame becomes unavoidable. A detention, even a brief one, requires justification. The longer it lasts, the stronger that justification must be. According to public legal standards, reasonable suspicion cannot be based on appearance, language, or generalized assumptions. It must be tied to specific, articulable facts. The footage shows the opposite trajectory. Time passes. The detention continues. The basis does not narrow, it expands. What began as a stop becomes a hold. What began as a question becomes a demand. This was another decision point. At that moment, the agents had options. They could verify identity through existing airport systems. They could consult supervisory guidance. They could disengage. Each option would have limited downstream exposure. Instead, the interaction remained static while the legal risk accumulated. The legitimacy gap widened further because of who the detainee was in functional terms. An airline captain operates under continuous federal scrutiny. Medical certification, background checks, recurrent training, and security vetting are not occasional events. They are ongoing conditions of employment. That does not confer immunity, but it does undercut the premise that lawful presence was uncertain. Again, the camera does not show this being weighed. The agent's authority was real. So was the captain's legitimacy. The conflict arose not from confrontation, but from misalignment between enforcement posture and legal reality. That misalignment is often invisible in real time. It becomes visible only later, when footage is reviewed frame by frame. According to court documents later filed in the case, the question was not whether the agents intended to violate rights. The question was whether, at each stage of the detention, the facts justified continuation. Intent was not required to establish liability. Procedure was. As the detention persisted, the legal foundation narrowed. Each minute without new justification converted uncertainty into exposure. The captain's continued compliance did not stabilize the situation. It amplified it. The longer the detention lasted, the clearer the legitimacy imbalance became on record. This was not a dispute resolved by persuasion or explanation. It was resolved by documentation. By the time the encounter moved beyond the initial agents, the footage had already locked in the sequence of events. The legitimacy gap was no longer theoretical. It was preserved, time-stamped, and reviewable. What began as a controlled interaction inside a secure facility had now crossed into a constitutional question. And once that line is crossed, the outcome is no longer shaped by authority in the moment, but by scrutiny afterward. The camera did not record outrage. It recorded process. And process, when misapplied, has consequences that do not fade when the encounter ends. To understand why the detention continued, it is necessary to shift away from the individual moment and toward the system operating around it. Federal agents working in airport environments function under overlapping layers of authority. Jurisdiction is shared. Responsibility is distributed. Accountability, however, often becomes diffuse. According to the footage, the agents on scene operated within a framework that prioritizes control and verification. In high-security environments, that posture is reinforced through training. Agents are conditioned to stabilize situations first and resolve uncertainties later. The problem arises when stabilization becomes justification in itself. This is not an accusation of motive. It is a description of institutional logic. In airports, the margin for perceived error is low. Agents are trained to avoid missed threats rather than to minimize intrusion. That imbalance influences decision-making. Once an individual is stopped, disengagement can feel like risk, even when the legal basis for continuation is thin. This dynamic explains what the footage shows next. Rather than narrowing the scope of the encounter, the agents maintained it. According to public records, no immediate supervisor intervened at the outset. No corrective guidance redirected the interaction. The absence of interruption allowed the initial decision to detain to harden into routine. This was another decision point. At this stage, departmental culture becomes relevant. In many enforcement agencies, questioning a colleague's on-scene judgment is discouraged unless a clear violation is visible. Deference fills the gap where review should occur. The result is escalation by inertia. The footage does not show hostility, it shows continuity. The agent's commands remain measured, the detainee remains compliant. Yet the legal posture worsens. Each additional step, each repeated demand, each delay narrows the range of defensible outcomes. What might have been justified as a brief inquiry begins to resemble an extended detention. Within departmental structures, this is where escalation often becomes unavoidable. Once paperwork is initiated, once logs are updated, once radio traffic reflects a detained subject, reversal requires justification of its own. Letting go becomes a decision, not the absence of one. That moment appears on camera as hesitation. According to the footage, agents pause, they confer, they reframe the encounter without materially changing it. The subject remains held, the justification remains unclear. The process continues. From a legal perspective, this is where liability quietly accumulates. Courts do not ask whether an officer felt uncertain. They ask whether uncertainty was supported by articulable facts. Silence on that point is not neutral. It is evidence of absence. Departmental context also shapes how such encounters are later reviewed. Internal affairs investigations focus on policy adherence, not outcome. If procedures allow discretion without mandatory verification steps, discretion becomes the shield. That shield weakens when footage contradicts the assumptions behind it. In this case, the environment worked against the agents. Airports are saturated with recording systems. Body cameras, fixed cameras, access logs, and time-stamped communications converge. Unlike street encounters, there is little ambiguity about sequence or duration. The department's later position, as reflected in filings, did not hinge on whether the captain was eventually released. It hinged on whether the continued detention was justified at each stage. That question became harder to answer as time passed. This was another chance to stop. They didn't. The agents were not operating outside policy as they understood it. They were operating at its edge. And when policy edges are tested under high visibility conditions, the outcome is rarely determined by intent. It is determined by record. By the time supervisory awareness increased, the interaction had already crossed a threshold. The system that empowered the agents to act now constrained their ability to retreat. Control had been maintained, but legitimacy had not been restored. The footage does not show a dramatic turning point. It shows something more consequential. It shows a system continuing forward because stopping would require acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, in structured enforcement environments, often comes too late. By the time the encounter moved beyond its initial phase, the detention was no longer incidental. According to the footage, the airline captain remained physically contained within the terminal space, his freedom of movement restricted not by barriers, but by continued commands. What had begun as a stop now functioned as a hold. This was the next decision point. In constitutional terms, duration matters. A brief detention justified by uncertainty requires active efforts to resolve that uncertainty. The camera does not show such resolution. Instead, it shows repetition. The same requests, the same posture, the same unanswered question of legal basis. The agents chose continuation. Each minute inside the terminal added weight to the encounter. Airports are designed for flow. People move. Delays are visible. A stationary subject stands out. The footage captures glances from passers-by, the subtle shift from anonymity to exposure. None of this was verbalized, but all of it was recorded. Another decision followed. Rather than narrowing the inquiry, the agents expanded the scope of control. According to the footage, the captain was instructed to remain in place while additional verification was considered. No new facts were articulated. No immediate threat was identified. The justification did not evolve, but the restraint did. This mattered legally. At this stage, courts later reviewing the footage would not ask whether the agents believed further inquiry was prudent. They would ask whether the continued restraint was proportionate to any identifiable suspicion. The footage preserved the answer by omission. The captain's response remained consistent. He did not flee. He did not resist. He did not interfere. Compliance, however, does not reset the clock. It accelerates it. The longer a compliant subject is detained without justification, the clearer the imbalance becomes. This was another chance to stop. They didn't. As the interaction continued, the agent's body language shifted. According to the video, stance widened. Hands rested closer to equipment. The encounter became less conversational and more procedural. These changes did not escalate the captain's behavior. They escalated the record. Another decision point followed. The agents opted to maintain detention while internal communication occurred. Radios were checked. Messages were exchanged. The captain remained in place, waiting. From a legal perspective, waiting is not neutral. It is time under restraint. The Fourth Amendment does not measure violations by volume or tone. It measures them by reasonableness. Reasonableness erodes when action is delayed without cause. The airport environment amplified this erosion. Cameras did not blink. Timestamps did not blur. Each second added clarity, not confusion. The longer the detention persisted, the more the footage shifted from ambiguous to explicit. The agents now faced a narrowing corridor of options. Releasing the captain without explanation would raise internal questions. Continuing without justification would raise external ones. The path chosen favored control over correction. This was another decision point. According to later filings, supervisory awareness increased during this period. The details of internal communication are not publicly disclosed in official records. What is clear from the footage is that the detention did not end when oversight became possible. It continued. The encounter reached a point where reversal would no longer erase exposure. The record was already established. Duration had replaced discretion. At that moment, authority did not collapse. It calcified. The camera captured a pause. Movement slowed. Voices dropped. The space around the captain widened slightly, not as release, but as recalibration. The environment changed. The balance shifted, not in action, but in implication. This was the silence before consequence. No analysis occurred on camera. No explanation was offered. The captain remained still. The agents remained present. The terminal continued moving around them. In that stillness, the legal outcome had effectively been set. Because escalation is not defined by force alone, it is defined by the accumulation of decisions that reduce lawful alternatives. Each choice to continue had done exactly that. By the time the encounter approached its conclusion, the question was no longer whether the detention could be justified. It was how it would be reviewed. The footage ensured that review would not rely on memory or interpretation. It would rely on sequence. And sequence, once recorded, does not negotiate. The detention would end. The agents would move on. The terminal would return to routine. But the escalation captured on camera would not disappear. It would travel forward, into reports, into filings, into a process that no longer belonged to the people on screen. This was no longer an encounter. It was evidence. The footage did not end the moment the detention ended. It began its second life there. According to the public record, multiple camera sources captured overlapping angles of the encounter. Fixed terminal cameras preserved duration and positioning. Body-worn cameras preserved tone, command cadence, and posture. Together, they formed a continuous timeline that required no reconstruction. The sequence was intact. Investigative review began with time. Reviewers did not need interpretation to establish how long the detention lasted. The timestamps were embedded. They did not need inference to identify when justification was articulated. The audio was synchronized. What they examined first was not motive, but continuity, whether new facts appeared to support continued restraint. They did not. The timeline showed repetition without development. Requests were restated, commands were maintained. Verification pathways existed but were not pursued. Each segment of footage reinforced the same pattern: control sustained in the absence of evolving cause. That pattern triggered escalation within the review process. Initial supervisory review focused on policy compliance. The question was narrow: did the agents act within the scope of their authority at each stage? The footage forced a stage-by-stage answer. Where justification did not advance, policy protection weakened. Internal affairs became involved. According to filings later referenced in court, investigators aligned the footage against constitutional standards rather than departmental preference. The analysis centered on reasonableness, not in hindsight but in sequence. What was reasonable at minute 1 was measured again at minute 5, minute 10, minute 15. The answers diverged. At this point, the review moved beyond the agent's actions and into institutional exposure. City attorneys assessed the evidentiary posture. The question was no longer whether the detention could be defended rhetorically, but whether it could withstand frame-by-frame scrutiny before a jury. The footage suggested it could not. And then the record pauses. The terminal is quiet on screen. Foot traffic thins. The captain stands still. The agents adjust their stance. No one speaks. The air changes. Posture changes. Authority stops advancing and starts waiting. In that silence, the outcome shifts. When analysis resumed, it focused on what the footage did not contain. No articulable suspicion emerging over time. No intervening threat. No verification attempt documented before continuation. Absence became the evidentiary anchor. That absence mattered more than any contested interpretation. According to court documents, the investigation concluded that the detention exceeded permissible bounds. The precise internal findings are not publicly disclosed in official records. What is disclosed is the result. The city's exposure was deemed substantial. Settlement discussions followed. The footage shaped those discussions, not as leverage, but as constraint. Once preserved, evidence narrows negotiation space. Each visible minute of unjustified detention increased projected risk. Each camera angle reduced uncertainty. The city's legal posture shifted from defense to mitigation. The airline captain's professional history re-entered the record here, not as authority asserted during the encounter, but as context reviewed afterward. Federal vetting, continuous compliance, routine presence in regulated space. None of it excused detention. All of it undermined its premise. The investigation did not rely on emotion. It relied on alignment. Footage aligned with constitutional standards. Policy aligned with footage. Exposure aligned with probability. By the time formal filings were complete, the trajectory was set. The city prepared for a legal resolution that reflected the strength of the record rather than the intent of the actors. The amount would be measured. The reasoning would be procedural. The cameras had already done their work. They had not captured outrage. They had captured duration. They had not captured resistance. They had captured continuation. And, in legal review, continuation without cause is not neutral. It is determinative. What remained was consequence. The legal consequences did not arrive suddenly. They arrived through process. Following internal review and preliminary investigative findings, the matter moved into formal legal posture. According to court records, filings were initiated alleging unlawful detention in violation of constitutional protections. The claims did not rely on disputed facts. They relied on the recorded sequence. The footage established duration. It established control. It established the absence of evolving justification. Those elements framed the case before any argument was made. City attorneys evaluated exposure early. This was another decision point. At this stage, the city was no longer assessing conduct, it was assessing risk. Jury perception became central. Airport settings carry implicit authority. Federal agents carry assumed legitimacy. When footage contradicts those assumptions, juries notice. The city's legal team analyzed how the encounter would appear when played without narration. No captions, no commentary, just time passing under restraint. The assessment was unfavorable. Settlement discussions began. The timing of those discussions is not publicly disclosed in official records. What is disclosed is the outcome. The city agreed to pay $9.2 million to resolve the case. The figure was not symbolic. It reflected projected trial risk, potential damages, and the clarity of the evidentiary record. No admission of wrongdoing accompanied the payment. None was required. Civil liability does not require intent. It requires impact. The footage supplied that impact with precision. Each additional minute of detention without justification translated into exposure. The total amount represented the city's acknowledgement of that accumulation. The agents involved did not control this phase. Once litigation commenced, authority shifted. Decisions were made in conference rooms, not terminals. The focus moved from enforcement to containment. Internal employment outcomes related to the agents are not publicly disclosed in official records. What is publicly confirmed is the financial resolution and the closure of the civil claims against the city. The payout did not erase the footage. It finalized its effect. From a legal standpoint, the case reinforced a familiar principle. In controlled environments, procedural deviations are magnified. Airports do not dilute scrutiny, they intensify it. Federal presence does not shield against review, it heightens expectations. The airline captain's role remained central in this phase, not because of who he was during the encounter, but because of what his professional record demonstrated afterward. Continuous compliance, verified identity, routine federal interaction. None of it had been disputed. All of it had been overlooked. That oversight became costly. The $9.2 million figure entered public record as a data point. It joined other settlements not as anomaly, but as precedent. City attorneys cited it internally, risk managers noted it, training coordinators referenced it. The amount signaled that extended detentions without articulated basis would not be treated as minor procedural errors. They would be priced accordingly. The resolution closed the individual case, but it did not close the record. Footage remains discoverable. Filings remain accessible. The sequence remains reviewable. Legal consequences do not end when payment is made. They persist in policy. The city moved forward. The captain moved forward. The agents returned to duty or transitioned according to internal determinations not disclosed publicly. The system absorbed the outcome and adjusted where necessary. What remained undeniable was the path from moment to outcome. A detention initiated without clear basis. Decisions compounded. Review activated. Evidence dominated. Liability followed. The law did not respond to who anyone intended to be. It responded to what the camera showed. And what it showed carried a price. The case did not end when the payment was authorized. Financial resolution closes claims, not questions. After the settlement, attention shifted from individual conduct to institutional adjustment. According to public reporting, agencies operating in airport environments reviewed detention protocols and interagency coordination procedures. The purpose was not to assign blame, but to prevent repetition. When footage produces a seven-figure outcome, it becomes instructional. Training emphasis changed. Detentions in secure facilities were reframed around duration and articulation. Officers were reminded that control without evolving justification is not stability. It is exposure. The presence of multiple verification systems inside airports was re-emphasized as a safeguard, not an obstacle. Supervisory intervention thresholds were clarified. Extended holds now triggered earlier review. The goal was not to limit authority, but to align it with constitutional pacing. In high-visibility environments, pacing is evidence. The footage remains central in these discussions, not as an example of misconduct, but as a record of sequence. The lesson was procedural. Once a detention begins, every subsequent minute must earn its place. Silence does not qualify. Policy revisions were not publicly detailed in full. Internal memoranda are not disclosed in official records. What is observable is the shift in emphasis across similar cases that followed. Documentation became proactive. Articulation became mandatory earlier in encounters. De-escalation included release as a legitimate option. The airline captain did not become a symbol within the system, he became a reference point, not by name, but by outcome. His case entered training modules as a timeline, not a narrative, minute by minute, decision by decision. The settlement amount did not represent punishment, it represented calibration. Institutions adjust when the cost of inaction exceeds the cost of change. In this instance, the calibration was measurable. The broader implication was clear. Federal presence does not displace constitutional restraint. Secure locations do not relax standards, they tighten them. When authority operates inside environments designed for transparency, every deviation is preserved. The footage made that unavoidable. No moral conclusions were issued, no statements of intent were required. The system responded the way systems do when confronted with undeniable record. It adapted. The cameras remained where they had always been. The law remained what it had always been. What changed was the margin for error. And in that sense, the case achieved its final effect not through words, but through structure. The structure of review. The structure of evidence. The structure of consequence. What began as a routine detention became a dataset, and datasets, once analyzed, reshape behavior. The footage did not argue, it documented. That was enough.